Hi, everybody. Okay, I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Adam Kirsch is the author of several books of poetry and criticism, a 2016 Guggenheim Fellow. He's an editor at the Wall Street Journal's Weekend Review section, has taught at Columbia University, and has written for publications including The New Yorker and Tablet. The title of today's talk is The Ideology of Settler Colonialism and the Israel-Palestine Conflict, which is drawn from his fascinating book on settler colonialism, published this year by Norton. Before we get started, just a word about how things will work. Adam will talk for about 40 minutes. When he's finished, he'll take questions from you, from the audience. So please submit your questions at any time during the talk using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is disabled. Those questions will come to me, and I will ask as many of them as I can get to. I apologize in advance if I don't ask your question. There are a lot of you on this webinar, and I have a feeling that the talk is going to generate a lot of discussion. So please join me in welcoming Adam Kirsch.
Thanks very much, Maurice, and thank you all for being here today. I appreciate your coming to listen to me talk about settler colonialism, which is an idea that I think a lot of us were probably not familiar with before October 2023, but which has really sort of emerged as an important buzzword or sort of frame of analysis for the conflict in Israel, especially in academia. And in writing this book, which is a short book on settler colonialism, I was moved to write it after October 7th when I saw the reaction to the way news of the Hamas attack was sort of generating in the United States immediately after the news arrived, before the Israeli retaliation, the invasion of Gaza, which has since cost many Palestinian lives and sort of generated a new and in some ways parallel protest movement. But even before that happened, right after October 7th, I think many of us will remember that on a lot of university campuses and from a lot of progressive organizations, you saw statements actively supporting and approving of the massacre of 1,200 Israeli civilians by Hamas. People tweeted or made statements on campuses, or official groups made statements, Black Lives Matter or Democratic Socialists of America, certain chapters of it. And what struck me at the time was that many or most of these statements supporting Hamas actually used the term settler colonial or settler colonialism when they were explaining why they supported the attack. So they said Israel is a settler colonial state. The attack is resistance to settler colonialism. One professor who I quote in the book said, there's a difference between civilians and settlers. Israelis are not civilians, they're settlers, and that means that all of them are legitimate military targets. So killing civilians in Israel does not really mean killing civilians at all. And I had been familiar with the idea of settler colonialism. I had seen how it had become an important concept in the academic humanities over, I'd say, the last 20 years, but especially in the last 10 years. And it's a phrase that, or a term that I think anyone who studied a humanities field in the last 10 years is probably familiar with, but people who are older may not have heard of. So what I wanted to do in this book was write an introduction to the idea of settler colonialism, a critical introduction, explaining sort of what this idea means, where it comes from, what the sources of it are, and some of the leading thinkers, and how it applies both to the history of the United States and to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which are the places where, at least in America, we hear the term deployed most often. One, I think, sort of sign of the way this term has become more popular is when I was discussing this book with my editor at W.W. Norton. She said that she had not heard the term settler colonialism, but all of the editorial assistants there did know it. And that's, of course, because they're in their 20s. They'd been to college more recently, so they were familiar with it. If you look at a college course catalog, you'll see that settler colonial studies is not really a department. It's not necessarily its own academic field, but it's an approach that can be used in conjunction with a lot of different fields. So it is used in conjunction with American history, also Australian and Canadian history, also Middle Eastern studies, but also things like environmental sciences, public health, gender studies. All of these fields have used and adopted the language of settler colonialism because they find it useful as a way to explain um, generally kinds of social injustice that exist in the present and trace them back to the origin of the United States and other countries in European colonialism. That's sort of the heart of what people mean when they're talking about settler colonialism. They're looking not really at the history of those events because that's really the province of historians. The way I say it in the book is that what I call the ideology of settler colonialism is best understood as a critical theory about the present, about current American or world problems. And in that way, it's sort of similar to the original Marxist critical theory of the 1950s and 60s at the Frankfurt School popularized, and the critical race theory that emerged out of American law schools in the 1970s. Those were ways of looking at the present through a theoretical lens or framework that explained the origins of what's wrong with society. And settler colonialism offers another kind of critical theory. It's a critical theory that says the problems with contemporary society in the United States or in the Middle East have to do with the fact that countries like Israel or America, Canada, and Australia were founded by European colonialism. And the key to this way of thinking is that these are colonialism or colonial settlement is not something that happened in the past. It's not a discrete event that happened in the past and is now over with. One of the most important figures in this field, one of the scholars who helped to establish the idea of settler colonialism as an academic field of study, was an Australian anthropologist named Patrick Wolfe, who's now deceased. But in the 1990s and 2000s, he wrote important books and papers on this subject. And the phrase or the sentence that's most often quoted in this literature is from Patrick Wolfe, where he wrote, invasion is a structure, not an event. He was talking about Australian history, and he was talking about the invasion of Australia by British settlers in the late 18th century. But in saying that it's a structure, not an event, what he means is that it's not something that happened in 1788 and is now over with. Rather, the society that emerged out of the process of settlement is itself a continuation of the invasion. The invasion perpetuates itself for as long as this settler colonial society exists. So, in thinking about the history of Australia or the US or Canada in that way, it changes the way we think about our past and also about our present and future. Essentially, it means that these societies are always illegitimate, always sort of usurping the true sovereigns, the true possessors of this land, which are the indigenous peoples that were displaced and in many cases killed to establish those countries. And in seeing those countries in this way, it calls into question a lot of the sort of basic founding principles of just to focus on America because that's where we are and that's what concerns us the most of American civilization and of the American ideas. And it's a very critical and adversarial approach to American history in ways that can be surprising, that can lead to some unexpected conclusions. So one of them that I talk about in the book is that in the sort of framework of settler colonialism, everyone is either a settler or indigenous. If you today in the 21st century, if your ancestors were indigenous people who were in North America before 1492, then you can claim to be indigenous. Everyone else is a settler. So that means that you don't have to have an ancestor who literally settled North America, a British colonist. You don't have to have an ancestor that came over on the Mayflower. Anyone who is not indigenous occupies the structural position of a settler in our society. And that can include people who, if your ancestors, say, came to America and as slaves from Africa, you are still, according to at least some theorists, you're still a settler because you are present on land that is not legitimately yours. You're part of a society that does not really belong here. The same is true of recent immigrants. If your ancestors came here, 5 years ago on a plane from China or from Africa, you are not an immigrant but a settler. One of the sort of distinctions here is that immigrant is a term that is disfavored in settler colonial studies because it implies that if you are immigrating to a country, you're coming to a country that exists, that sort of is a valid country that you can come to belong to and be a part of. Whereas in fact, you are becoming a settler in the sense that you're joining in on the usurpation of North America from its true and original possessors, who are Native Americans. One of the interesting things about this is that it cuts against even earlier progressive ideas about American history. I think we're used to certain progressive ideas about American history that challenge the original ideas of, say, 19th century patriotic historiography. If you look at the way American history was written in the 19th century, or the sort of really up until the 20th century or World War II, it was common to see the story of the United States as the story of the advance of freedom, the advance of liberty. Certainly, patriotic historians in the 19th century saw something providential about the United States and said that, from the discovery of the Americas by Columbus through the founding of the U.S., that this was sort of part of the destiny of liberty to triumph throughout the world. In the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln famously said that America was sort of the test for self-government around the world. It was the place, a laboratory where people would show whether it was possible for a nation to govern itself. One of the sort of cost of that way of thinking about American history was that it left out the experience of non-white people. It left out the experience of African slaves and of indigenous Native Americans, because when those stories are included in American history, it's much harder to see it as a story of the sort of unbroken progress of liberty. So in the 20th century, there were challenges to this sort of traditional historiography, and they took the form of multiculturalism, the idea that America is not a melting pot in which everyone is sort of becoming an American, but rather as different groups, different peoples arrive in the United States, they contribute to shape the meaning of America in their own image, that it's a salad bowl rather than a melting pot. Or as Horace Callan, who was sort of an influential thinker on this in the World War I era, said, different ethnic groups in America are like different instruments in an orchestra, and they all contribute to playing the symphony, but they all play different roles. They shouldn't all be the same. It's the differences that sort of allow them to create the music. With the civil rights movement, there was a Martin Luther King helped to promote a new idea of American history, which I think became widely adopted in sort of the established version in the late 20th century, which was the acknowledgement that when America was founded, it was incomplete, that its promises weren't extended, weren't kept to all of its people. But as he famously said at the March on Washington, that the civil rights movement was coming to collect a promissory note, that the promises made in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution had not been kept, and that by insisting that they be kept, by extending the promise of liberty and justice to all Americans, not just white Americans and white men, that we in the present were sort of continuing the founding. We were completing the founding. So it wasn't repudiating American ideals, but it was sort of insisting that they actually be brought into practice, into realization. The idea of settler colonialism really rejects both of those ideas. It rejects the idea of progress toward a more perfect union, and it rejects the idea of multiculturalism, because it sees American history through this binary framework. There's really no way that American civilization can atone for, can make up for the original fact that it was built on conquest and the displacement of indigenous people. And so as long as America exists, it will be basically a tainted, illegitimate society, a society founded on sin. And one of the things I write about in the book is that this leads to ways of thinking and even ways of expression that can feel religious, that feel religious and invoke ideas like original sin or like predestination. So you don't have to personally be a settler to carry the guilt of settlement. You can be guilty of something that happened hundreds of years before your birth or that your own ancestors were not involved in at all. And part of what the discourse of settler colonialism is about is taking responsibility for those settler ways of being, which is a term that's often used, and trying to purge them both in public ways, political ways, but also in personal and private and even spiritual ways. So there are people who write about, how do you decolonize? Decolonization in this context doesn't mean what it did when the decolonization movement happened in Africa and Asia after World War II. It doesn't mean getting rid of all of the colonizers, all of the settlers, because that is not something that could be plausibly imagined in the United States. When you're decolonizing, India, or for that matter, Israel, getting rid of the British in Israel, that meant getting rid of a very small number of people. In America, 98% of the population is not of indigenous origin, so you can't really imagine getting rid of 98% of the people. So when people talk about decolonizing the United States, they're really talking about a shift in attitudes, in systems, in our way of being, our ways of thinking, and it can be linked to a whole variety of progressive political causes and critiques. So it's common to hear that capitalism is a form of settler colonialism because Europeans introduced it in North America, whereas before there had been harmony and equality. Also, environmental depredations are thought of as a legacy of settler colonialism because Europeans came and took resources, violated the land, whereas people who had lived here before lived lightly on the land and in balance. It can also be extended to gender relations, to patriarchy, to questions of sexuality. All of these, by different academic theorists, are thought of as legacies of settler colonialism. So how do you decolonize? It means that you change the way you think. It can mean decolonizing your bookshelf, which is a term that became prominent a few years ago, which means reading non-white authors. And it's extended in lots of ways. Decolonize your backyard in the sense of don't plant invasive species, only plant native species. There are all kinds of both serious and less serious ways of thinking about what it means to decolonize. One example that I give in the book has to do with a running dispute over constructing a telescope, a deep space telescope in Hawaii on Mauna Kea, which is an extinct volcano. And has been a plan for about 15 years to build something called the 30-meter telescope there, which would be in a space observatory. And it ran into protests from Native Hawaiians because they saw the mountain as a sacred site and they didn't want a telescope built there, and they thought it would be disturbing their sacred site and also causing environmental damage. But I talk about in the book how there's also a paper that I discuss which says that the idea of seeing back 14 billion years to collect photons from the origin of the universe is an inherently settler colonialist project because it means defying the ways that Native Hawaiians before European arrival saw space and time. The way they thought about space and time didn't include a 14 billion year old universe. It didn't include things like photons. And so to build an observatory on this land is a sort of an act of intellectual settlement, of intellectual colonialism. So when you talk about ramifications like that, you start to see how the idea of settler colonialism in certain important ways is not really a progressive idea. It's an idea that is usually named and used by people who call themselves progressive. I mean, I think just about everyone who studies settler colonialism or who advances a settler colonial agenda or critique would call themselves a progressive. But in certain ways, it sort of comes all the way around from progressive to become reactionary. It is against the ideas like progress, like science, like, for example, the will of the majority, because the basis of settler colonial critique is that 98% of the people have sort of taken the land from the 2% who really should own it and deserve it. So in that sense, it's the direct opposite of Occupy Wall Street. If you remember Occupy Wall Street about 15 years ago, the slogan was, "We are the 99%." The 99% going to take the money and power from the most wealthy and powerful 1%. This is sort of the direct converse of that. It's saying we're going to take from the 98% to return to the 2%. And there are some scholars who I discuss in the book who say make exactly that comparison, saying this is the opposite of Occupy Wall Street. So in a strange way, a progressive movement comes to endorse things like blood and soil ideas, the idea that an indigenous people is indigenous to a certain land and that that is the only people that can exist on that land, and everyone else who is there is a sort of stranger or usurper or colonialist and can never really be legitimate there. And it says that indigenous peoples have different ways of thinking and of knowing, which are superior to settler colonialist ways, and the settler colonialist ways have to be sort of unlearned and untaught, whether that means science or industry or even things like mining and national parks, which are often talked about as examples of settler colonial domination because they exercise control over what should be native land. So those are in the first half of the book, I talk about a lot of these issues relating to the history of the United States. And then in the second half of the book, I talk about how and why the idea of settler colonialism has come to be applied specifically to Israel. I think that most often now, especially in the last couple of years, when you hear people use the term, they are using it in the context of Israel and Palestine. I think that one reason why that happens is that, as I mentioned, it's impossible to imagine concretely decolonizing a country like Australia or America or Canada. Those are the countries that are almost always talked about under the umbrella of settler colonialism, certainly in English language scholarship, talking about those Anglophone countries. In those countries, you can't physically or concretely, politically decolonize. You can't sort of wind back the clock. Although there are people who will say, one day these societies will disappear and these lands will become native again. But it remains a sort of rhetorical enterprise, not a concrete political struggle. But Israel is sort of a case where you can concretely imagine the country disappearing and reverting to the possession of the people who were there before it was created, who are the Palestinian Arabs. It's a place where the fight against settler colonialism is not just academic and theoretical, but is with guns and bombs. And that's one reason why I think an important reason why people who are invested in this worldview, who see the world through the lens of settler colonialism, sort of reacted instinctively in a positive way to the October 7th attack. Because for them, it wasn't an example of terrorists killing civilians. It was an example of a resistance movement to settler colonialism. And if settler colonialism is sort of the great evil in the world today, it's what explains what's wrong with the world in all kinds of ways, then an attack on settler colonialism is sort of inherently virtuous and progressive, no matter what form it takes and no matter who is committing it. And so I think that's how you get to the strange spectacle of progressive students and some faculty celebrating an Islamic fundamentalist group like Hamas, which actually is opposed to everything that they concretely believe about gender equality, about homosexual rights, about everything that is part of the progressive platform is something that Hamas is actively against. But progressives embraced Hamas because it was resisting settler colonialism. And I think you could draw an analogy to the way that radical student movements in the 1960s embraced third world communist regimes like Mao's China or Fidel Castro's Cuba, not because they actually really knew much about what was going on there, or certainly not because they wanted to go and live there, but because they said if the main problem in the world is American imperialism, and these are the forces fighting American imperialism, then they are on the right side of history, and so we should support them. I think it's a similar thing that goes on when you see or have seen over the last year and a half students waving Hamas or Hezbollah flags. In their minds, they are serving a virtuous cause. So the big question, or one of the big questions, is why is Israel included in this category of settler colonial societies? In certain sort of very obvious ways, the history of Israel does not match the history of the United States, Canada, or Australia. And I don't think I even need to explain, the very obvious ways in which that's not the case. But one important way has to do with the concept of genocide, which is very central to the idea of settler colonialism. Patrick Wolf said, whenever we're talking about settler colonialism, we're also talking about genocide, because at the root of the settler colonial critique is the idea that these countries that were colonized by Europeans were created by committing a genocide of indigenous peoples. And I think that that is at least an arguable thesis you might say that genocide is not the right word to use for the sort of 2 or 3 century long process of American expansion across the continent. But there's no doubt that that process involved killing many millions of Native Americans and displacing them and expropriating them. So it's one thing to see that as a history of genocide, or to see the settlement of Australia as a genocide of Aboriginal Australians, which is something that is a controversial debate in Australia as well. But there's no history of genocide in the creation of the state of Israel, in the sense that the creation of Israel did not involve exterminating or replacing Palestinian Arabs. In fact, you could say that the reason why there is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict today is a sign that there was no such replacement, because there's not a conflict like that in America or Canada, because one people uh, sort of completely replaced the other, and so there was no one left to fight with. In fact, what you have right now in Israel and Palestine, in the area between the river and the sea, as the slogan has it, is a situation where there are about equal numbers of Jews and Arabs. There are about 7.5 million of each in that very small region. It's a region about the size of the state of New Jersey. And so it's not a people that committed genocide on and replaced another people. It's a people that came and inserted itself into a land that had been dominated by Palestinian Arabs, and did so against the will of those people, in a process of settlement that began in the 1880s and continued over the next 60 years, and ultimately concluded, or sort of was finalized in the War of 1948. And so a lot of the discussion of Israel as a settler colonialist country has to do with Zionism as a movement. Zionism was the movement, the aegis under which Jews came from Europe to settle in what would become Israel from the 1880s to the 1940s. And in the discourse of settler colonialism, it's sort of doctrinal. It's taken for granted that Zionism was a settler colonial movement. And beyond that, because settler colonialism is usually thought of as a sort of case of white Europeans expropriating non-white native peoples, that lens is also applied to Israel. So it becomes Zionism is a kind of white European colonialism, which came and took land from non-white Arabs by force and took over their land, established a country there, and in that process, it sort of became a settler colonial country in the same way as America and Canada. Well, one of the most important ways that fails to meet even just a historical description is that Zionism saw itself not as a colonial movement, but precisely as an indigenous movement. It was a movement in which Jews said, we are the indigenous people of the land of Israel. We are returning to our native land, our historic homeland, because life in Europe is untenable, because it's too dangerous and we have no future here, which was a Zionist prediction that seemed radical at the time it was first made, but proved to be 100% correct, that there was literally no future for Jews in Europe. And the ones who got out either to America or to Israel survived, and most who remained in Eastern Europe were killed in the Holocaust. So to say that Zionism is a colonial movement sort of disregards the most important dynamic of Zionism, which is that it was an indigenous return movement. And one of the things I say in the book is that if you could imagine what would it look like for Native Americans to reestablish a homeland on the territory of the United States, say in one state or in one region. And Native Americans from around the continent came to this region, created a new state, made their languages the official languages, created a new culture and a new society. That is exactly what Zionism was. It looks exactly like that. It was Jews returning to the land of Israel, speaking Hebrew, creating a Jewish society. So when the conflict is cast as a European colonial movement, I think it misunderstands not only the motives and the actions of Jewish settlers, but even more important than that, it misunderstands what are the possibilities for the future in Israel. Resistance to colonialism, resistance to European colonialism in the places where it succeeded in the 50s and 60s succeeded because it was able to drive out Europeans to send them back to their home country. The sort of most famous example was in Algeria. Algeria, which had been a French colony since the 1830s, and where by the 1950s, something like 10 or 15% of the total population was European. There was a war, a national liberation movement that used terrorist tactics, the FLN, um, against the French settlers. And the way that the FLN won that war essentially was by convincing France that the price of defending that colony was too high and that it wasn't worthwhile for them to pay it. And that is sort of the classic way that resistance movements, that anti-colonial movements have always succeeded in history, starting, you could say, with the American Revolution. The American Revolution was sort of the first successful anti-colonial movement. It won not by defeating the British, because the British could have kept fighting. It won by inflicting enough damage and enough cost in human lives and in money on the British that the British finally said, this is not worth it. We're picking up and going home. And that is how native resistance movements triumph over imperialist occupiers. It's how the Vietnamese got the French out of Vietnam and later the Americans out of Vietnam. It's how Afghanistan got Americans out of Afghanistan. Because essentially the occupier, the empire, the imperialist always has somewhere else that they can go. They can always go home. And the native people doesn't have anywhere else to go. So eventually, in the long run, the native people will win. But if Israel is understood as a European colony, as a settler colony established by white Europeans, then that suggests that the same tactics could work in Israel. That if enough violence is used, terrorist atrocities against civilians, which is exactly what the FLN did in Algeria, that eventually you could get rid of the Israeli Jews, you could make them leave, you could make them go back where they came from. But of course, there is no mother country for Israel. Israel doesn't have a mother country because it wasn't established as the colony of a European empire. On the contrary, it was established by refugees from persecution in Europe, refugees from European countries who were leaving countries where they were being killed, or at the very least, seriously oppressed. And so there's no country, no mother country that has an obligation to defend Israel, and there's no country that has an obligation to take in Israeli Jews if they were to be driven out, the way that France took in Algerian Pied Noir after the Algerian independence was achieved. So, in seeing this as a settler colonial conflict, I think that what progressives do is they turn the conflict between Jews and Arabs into a zero sum conflict. It says Jews do not belong here. This is not their land. They have no connection to it. They're colonial occupiers in the same way that the French were colonial occupiers in Algeria. And any means that is used to drive them out is just, including killing civilians, which is exactly what we saw on October 7th in reaction to it. Meanwhile, the Israelis say, we have no other home, we have nowhere to go. And for them, they will fight not like the occupying empires, but like a native people, because they say, this is our native land. We don't have any other homeland. And we will fight with every means we have to stay here because we don't want to be destroyed. We don't want to become the victims of a second genocide, which is essentially what the Hamas program would entail. So if Israel is a settler colonial country fighting against native people, then there's no prospect of ever achieving peace. There's no settlement that could possibly satisfy that conflict, because if America is a settler colonial society after 400 years and Australia is a settler colonial society after 250 years, then certainly Israel was a settler colonial society after less than 80 years. And the conflict can only be fought and fought until one side achieves victory. Where I end in the book is to say that that way of looking at the conflict, it doesn't help either Jews or Arabs. It's not the recipe for a better future for either party to the conflict. And that, in fact, one of the key things that I took away from studying these ideas and reading about settler colonialism was that in a basic way, what it is a desire to undo the past. It's a desire to redeem the past, to say that the evil things that happened in the past, European colonialism, or the Nakba of 1948, where Palestinian refugees were driven from their homes in Israel's War of Independence, that those things should not have happened, and that therefore they can be reversed and undone. And I think that if we take that approach, we're not able to actually change the past because that's impossible. But what you can do is create new insoluble conflicts that will last into the future. You create, instead of ending conflicts, you create new conflicts based on past injustices. And that the only way that peace is achieved is for both parties to a conflict to say, we would rather live in peace the way things are than continue to fight to make them the way that we want them to be or think that they should be. So in the case of Israel and Palestine, I think over the last year and a half, we've seen a real rise in the idea that Israel is an illegitimate country that should not exist. That was once a sort of a fringe idea, and now I think it's become a very mainstream position that you hear from a lot of people who consider themselves pro-Palestinian in the United States or progressive. They say Israel should not exist. Israel should be destroyed. People who are fighting for it are fighting for a good cause. And that is a sort of recipe for perpetual conflict and even worse conflict for as long as we can see into the future. Right now, I don't think there is any realistic prospect of a sort of peaceful two-state solution. I think there's not on neither side is there any real desire for that. But I think that eventually that's the only solution that can be imagined that doesn't involve great suffering and injustice to either Israelis or Palestinians. And so in the end, that I think is going to be where the solution comes from, provided that there isn't another catastrophe that ends up being a much worse outcome for one of those two peoples. So, sort of the conclusion of the book is settler colonialism, what I call the ideology of settler colonialism, I think is grounded in a virtuous idea, in a virtuous emotion, which is indignation against injustice, in much the same way that for an earlier generation, communism was rooted in indignation against injustice. It was saying there's evils in the world, they should not exist, and we need to remedy them. But the way in which those evils are understood and framed, and the way that they're remedied, the proposed remedy, actually will not remedy them, but make things worse and sort of exacerbate the evils even more than they are today. So I hope that if people read the book, they'll come away with an understanding of what people are talking about when we talk about settler colonialism, what that slogan means to people, whether they see it on a sign or whether it's used in a classroom, and also how one can dispute it and what some of the weaknesses of that idea are without rejecting, the sort of the truth of these histories, because I think ultimately you can't deny the truth of these histories, that they involve suffering for Native peoples, but how to think about them in a constructive way for the future rather than in a way that turns them into sources of sort of permanent conflict. So maybe I'll stop there for now after talking for a long stretch, and we can talk, Maurice, you and I could talk, or we could take questions from the audience.
Sure. Sure. Thank you so much, Adam. I think, the way you describe this, often very complicated, dense theory in such a clear way is really admirable. And that same tone, I think, is also in the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think anyone who has read the book just, really appreciates how clearly you lay out these arguments. So, okay, lots of questions, and I encourage people to please send me questions using the Q&A. So I'll start us off. There are a lot of questions that are essentially clustered around the same idea, which is, aren't Jews essentially indigenous to the land of Israel-Palestine? If they're not, then where are they indigenous? Weren't they murdered during World War II precisely for not being indigenous to Europe?
Yeah.
And, I would say similar kind of question, and there are several iterations of this. Aren't Palestinians, aren't in a sense Arabs, the product of a later invasion to this, and is that even the right way? Should we be trying to figure out who was there first, or does that enter into this problematic logic?
Right. No, I think that's a very good question. It's something that sort of immediately people think of when we're talking about priority, historical priority, right? The Zionist movement said Jews had a kingdom, a state in parts of what's now Israel, starting 3,000 years ago, and the Bible is the story of that kingdom and how it was created mythologically and historically, how it sort of was destroyed and then revived. And really, the diaspora, the end of that Jewish sovereignty, came in the first century CE, after a Jewish war where the Romans crushed a Jewish revolt, and then the next generation crushed a second revolt. And that destroyed the kingdom of Judah, which had existed in one form or another in biblical times, and sent Jews into this life of diaspora, of exile. And basically all of what we consider Judaism, Judaism as practiced in the last 2,000 years, is a religion of exile. It's about how do we practice this religion? How do we be Jews when we're not in the land that was promised in the Bible, not able to perform the rituals and the sacrifices that were originally the center of Judaism? And so there's a lot of very complicated theological and practical and ritual uh, things in Judaism about exile, about what it means to live in exile. And in most of that time, until the late 19th century, Jews said, "We will return to the land of Israel when the Messiah comes." This was a religious idea. When the Messiah comes, history will come to an end, and we'll be brought back to our native land. And there were always some Jews living in the land of Israel, but not very many. Sometimes just maybe 100 or so. In the 19th century, more started to settle, but it wasn't until the 1880s that Zionism arose as a sort of modern political movement to say, we're not going to wait to go back to the land of Israel. It's not a religious goal. This is a political goal that we're going to do now in exactly the same way that Italians and Germans and Poles and Hungarians sort of created their states. We're going to create our state, and it's a Jewish state in our traditional ancient homeland. So, yes, the idea of Zionism is an indigenous people returning to its land. And if you take the 2,000-year time scale, then Jews were there before Arabs, before Christians, before Islam. However, if you look at it from the time scale of the late 19th century, when Jews began to arrive, the Ottoman Empire province of Palestine was an Arab country. It was populated almost exclusively by Arabs, both Muslim and Christian. And the Arabs who were there, really right from the beginning, did not want a large-scale Jewish immigration. They objected to it. And after World War I, when the Ottomans lost that province to the British, and the British took over, and famously in the Balfour Declaration encouraged Jewish immigration for the first time. In the Palestinian national narrative, and you can read this in historians like Rashid Khalidi, that was a great betrayal of Palestinian Arabs because it was saying, we're going to give this land to the Jews, even though the Arabs living there don't want us to. It's going to be created in defiance of you. And that is where the story starts to look like an example of European colonialism, because to Palestinian Arabs, they say, well, if it hadn't been for the British Empire and these Jewish immigrants, this would be an Arab country, and instead it's a Jewish country, and we never wanted that. There's a lot of historical turning points in the story, and people who argue about the history of Israel, debate about it, know what they are, sometimes in very fine detail, to an extent that people who don't know, I think, find baffling. And so there's a lot of this argument is an argument about, well, who was right in 1918, or who was right when the Peel Commission wanted to divide the land in 1937. All of those are valid historical arguments, but I do think that what they reveal is that you can't see this as a question of historical priority. You can't simply say, whose land was this originally? Because originally depends on when you're going back to. Depending on where the starting point is, you get different answers. And I think that the same thing is absolutely true of any place in the world. We're talking about Israel. It's true of every place, every country, every inhabited territory was once inhabited by someone else. And basically every state known to history was created by conquest and settlement. So if you want to, you could say, it's not just the British Empire that was created by conquest and settlement. The only reason there is in England is because German tribes conquered it and settled there in the 5th century. So why not give it back to, the Welsh, who are the descendants of the Britons? That's one reason why I think that this idea of settler colonialism leads to a world of perpetual conflict, because instead of saying, this is the world that we live in, this is the world that we can change, it says, let's try to undo this world and go back to the way things were in some imaginary past when everyone was in the right place. Every people belonged in the right place. Ironically, that used to be considered a reactionary idea. That was considered a sort of right-wing nationalist idea. And I even say in the book that some of the most anti-Israel and kind of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist discourse really has a lot in common with like Nazi discourse about blood and soil. It says, the Jews didn't really belong in Germany because they were aliens. And in the same way, someone like Stephen Salaida, who's a notorious figure in this context, says Jews don't really belong in Israel because they have no organic connection to the land, and to them it's just a commodity, and they can't feel the beauty of it the way that Arabs can. All of those are sort of irrational ideas about who a land belongs to. And so I think that's not really a strong basis to justify the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. When I talk on this subject to religious audiences, to religious Jewish audiences, I sometimes get an angry reaction to that. Because I'm not saying the reason why Jews should have the state of Israel is because it was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I think that once you start arguing in those terms may hold true for religious Jews, but they're not convincing to people who aren't religious Jews. So, in order to have a sort of rational and humane debate between people who don't share their first principles, you have to think about it in not in terms of divine right or ancient history, but what's going on there now and how can the conflict be ended.
Okay. So I think most of the audience is very sympathetic to what you're arguing, but there is one kind of very interesting sort of attempt to push back, and I want to make sure that we get that. And I want to read the whole thing, but it's basically saying, okay, but should we take settler colonialist theory literally, or is it actually just maybe trying to get us to think in certain ways? So let me read what this colleague actually writes. I have read your smart and courageous book and believe it says many things that have to be said. That said, I see a moral ambiguity in your book and your talk. While yes, it is impossible and reprehensible to call for a settler colonial state to disappear, the metaphor does have the effect, I think, of creating a sense of moral responsibility on the part of a dominant group, and in this way, stimulating a self-critical attitude and some ameliorating actions that might follow. Do you agree with that? And do you not believe that even Jewish Israelis, who I agree did not commit settler colonialism, could do with a good dose of guilt for their forceful coercion against the Palestinian Arabs who were once the dominant power in their land?
That's a very good question. I'm not reading the chat, so I'm not seeing who's asking these questions, but I think that's a very good question. And I think that maybe it plays out in different ways in the American context and in the Israeli context. In the American context, I think that most people who talk about settler colonialism do want exactly that. They want a change in mindset. There are a few people who will say we should find some concrete ways to decolonize parts of North America or change the definition of sovereignty so that Native peoples will have sovereignty over their land. Interestingly, that's not something that Native American advocacy groups say. Native American advocacy groups don't use the language of settler colonialism. They talk about other things like treaties and laws. But there are people who see it in those terms. For most people, however, that is exactly what they want to do. They want to change the way Americans think about their history, to acknowledge the destruction of Native Americans that was part of that history, and to sort of validate that, to understand that that's an important part of the American story. But whether that actually leads to any constructive change, certainly any change that benefits Native people, but even beyond that, any constructive change, I don't necessarily think so. And I think that a good example is land acknowledgements, which is something I talk about in the book, but hadn't mentioned in this talk. Sort of the most concrete way that a lot of us experience these ideas or come into contact with them is a land acknowledgement, especially in a university, but also if you go to
maybe say what that is, because it's deeply familiar to those of us in academia, but I think for other people, they might have no idea.
Sure. So a land acknowledgement is the statement that you'll hear either spoken aloud at an event or posted on signage or online, where an institution will say, we acknowledge that we occupy land that originally belonged to a specific Native people, name them, and often along with that, we'll give a statement of sort of gratitude or apology to those people, saying that they were the traditional custodians of the land, or that we sort of occupied illegitimately, or we benefit from their dispossession. And those can be drawn up in different ways. That, I think, is something that maybe 7 years ago, absolutely no one had ever heard of and never thought was something that anyone was responsible for doing. And in the last, really over a period of maybe 2 or 3 years, became absolutely de rigueur in academia, so that every university now has one. Often every department in the university has one. And people who represent a university, say at an academic conference, will often introduce themselves with a land acknowledgement. And you also see them in museums and theaters and other kinds of nonprofit organizations. Sometimes local city governments have them. All of those they're symbolic ways of saying we acknowledge that there was a native people here before us. But in a way, that doesn't add to what we already know about the history of this country, right? Everyone who knows the American history knows that as a fact. And in fact, all you have to do is look at a map and look at the place names on the American map to know that a lot of those place names were taken from native peoples who were displaced or destroyed. And so really what the question is not, is that true, but what purpose is being served by making that part of the etiquette, by saying it is incumbent on us to acknowledge this in a formal public way. Someone wrote to me after the book was published and said that it reminded them of the way that, maybe in the 19th century, graduation ceremony would always begin with a Christian prayer, an invocation. This is sort of a similar thing. It's saying this is the ethic, this is the moral that we want to inculcate, that we want to remind people of. And essentially what that moral is saying this country should not exist. This country came into being through a crime, and this institution occupies someone else's land and is irredeemably in their debt. Is that true in a certain way? Yes, in a certain way it is true. Does it mean that any institution with land acknowledgement intends to do anything about it? No, they don't. They don't intend to give up their land, to repatriate it, to give reparations to the descendants of people who were there before. Also, it doesn't reflect the fact that the people who are acknowledged as the native people in that land, or the custodian or the immemorial presence, just are the people who were there when white settlers got there. In a way, it dehistoricizes all of Native America. It says that the way things were when Europeans showed up was the way they had always been for the last 10,000 years, which of course is not true. And historians of Native America know very well that it's not true. So I don't think that actually leads to any real improvement for anyone on a concrete level. That's in America. In Israel, I think it's quite different, because I think that if you had a situation where instead of 98% of Americans being settlers and 2% indigenous, it was 50-50. And in fact, the settlers were surrounded by 22 other countries who were of the same background as the indigenous people, and had repeatedly fought wars with you and openly wanted to destroy you. Then to demand that the Jews in Israel say, really, we need to apologize for the way we got here, it was a crime. I don't think any Israeli Jews are prepared to do that or see it as in their interest to do that. And very few would even entertain the discussion of it. Some would, and they're exactly the same as the people here. They're intellectuals and academics and artists. Those are the people who are willing to have that conversation. But for most people, that feels like giving a weapon to the enemy in an active fight, a fight of people who are trying to kill you. And so I don't think that most people would welcome that or would see it as something that they're morally obligated to do. The goal, yes, is for both peoples to recognize how complex the history is. And I think there are people on both sides who do recognize that and are working to try to make that real. And ultimately, I think peace will depend on that. It'll depend on both people saying, we both have a history of suffering here, we both have a right to be here. But I don't know that settler colonialism is really advancing that goal in any meaningful way.
Okay, so there's an interesting question, and it's something that occurred to me also as I was reading the book, which is, okay, unfair, historically wrong to say that Israel as a whole is a settler colonialist country for the reasons you say. But what about the occupation of the West Bank? And
yes,
when I talk to a lot of people on camp, like students sometimes, that's what they're thinking of,
yes.
and it slips into the denouncing all of Israel, but they're really thinking about that.
Well, yes, and I do think that one reason why the discourse in Israel has moved in a more radical direction is because the occupation has gone on so long, and there's been no progress towards ending it, certainly in the last 25 years, that people who are just get fed up and they say, if this is going to go on forever, then the whole country is wrong and shouldn't exist. And so in a way, refusing to differentiate between legal and illegal borders of Israel, or sovereign Israel and occupied territory, is something that left-wing critics of Israel do. And it's also what right-wing Israeli nationalists do. They say all of this land is ours. There's no real reason to say some of it is and some of it isn't. All of it belongs to us. Again, both of those are sort of totalizing, oversimplifying views. I think that, yes, in the West Bank, not in Gaza, because Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. There's a different kind of problem there. But in the West Bank, there is something more like what people think of as classic settler colonialism, where there's a Jewish population, a smaller Jewish population that lives in the midst of a larger Arab population, and the state is on the side of the Jews, and sort of the society is organized to protect the Jews and to benefit the Jews, and not the rest of the people, which is very much like what it was like in Algeria as well. Um, I think that all of that is true. And in fact, when writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote a book about this recently, go to the West Bank, and also Jewish writers, and they're appalled by what they see there, and they see it as an injustice, they're not wrong. They're reacting to what's actually going on there. The question is, how does that situation come to an end? How is it possible to end that occupation? And I think that this is one of the things that people will argue endlessly: who was responsible, who didn't take the offer. There was a period in the 1990s when it seemed like that might be negotiated, and the Israeli view is that they made their maximum offers several times to the PLO, and the PLO rejected it. And I think that, in the end, what it comes down to is that neither side was able to renounce its claims. The Palestinians are not able to renounce their claims to all of Israel, and the Israelis are not able to renounce their claims to the occupied territories. And I think that until that happens, the occupation is not going to end. I think that there are two reasons why Israelis don't end the occupation. I think, I'm not an expert on this subject, but it seems to me. One is religious reasons, that what's called the occupied territories are in fact biblical Israel, Judea and Samaria, which is what Israelis call them, or many do. And so they don't want to give up that land. The other reason is simply has to do with geopolitical survival, because they say, we withdrew from Gaza and we got Hamas. We withdrew from Lebanon and we got Hezbollah. If we withdraw from the West Bank, we'll have another armed group dedicated to destroying us, except instead of being sort of at the edge, they'll be right in the center of the country, right, 10 miles from Jerusalem. And we can't live that way. We can't survive that way. So this is why the conflict is so difficult to solve, is that it's sort of each side needs to sacrifice to make the other side trust them, and neither side will sacrifice because they don't trust the other side.
Okay, we are almost out of time, but I wanted to ask a question about, other possible solutions and so for instance, reparations for the Palestinians displaced in 1948, the Nakba. How does settler colonial theory view the concept of reparations? Is that inherently illegitimate, off the table? There's only one form of justice?
I think that reparations are not, it might depend on the person and the case, but I think that reparations don't get at the basic problem with a settler colonial society, which is that the society itself is illegitimate. And so reparations almost sounds like saying, well, we're going to pay you and then we're quits. Then, now we've paid you for what we took and now it's ours. And the basic idea of this ideology is that you cannot do that. You can't remedy that original injustice. And in fact, some of the people that I talk about say things like, even equality would be wrong, because if you were to say indigenous people and colonial people are equal under the law, they're all citizens of the same country, even that means ending the original native sovereignty and forcing native people to take part in this colonial sovereignty. And so that's just as bad. It's not really a form of reparation. In the Israeli context, I think one of the core of the problem is that reparation is not on the table, because what it means different things to different people. But the form of reparations that the Palestinian movement wants is to be able to return to the land lost in 1948. And that is what Israel considers impossible.
And is there any example in modern history of people who were displaced for whatever reason from from a national territory actually getting it back? In all of the kind of mass displacements that have gone on since in the 20th century.
It's a good question. I'm not, other than things that were strictly a wartime occupation, and when the war ended with the defeat
like
of the
Alsace-Lorraine in France or something like that. Yeah.
Right. Or like the Germans in Poland or the Japanese in Manchuria. That's a pretty good example of settler colonialism as well. Those come to an end when the power is just defeated. But other than that, no. And I think that if you look at like Tibet or Xinjiang, those are good examples of what people talk about when they talk about settler colonialism. And there's no prospect of reversing them because there's no one powerful enough to make it stop. Um, so I think there's few examples, except of course you might say that Israel is the example of a people that got its land back.
Yeah. Okay, so I apologize to everyone whose questions I didn't get to ask. I think many of them I asked some version of it. So, but we don't want to take up more of Adam's time, but please join me in thanking Adam for that very lucid and helpful explanation. I urge everyone to get the book, and you won't hear everyone clapping, but I'm sure they are along with me.
Thank
So
you.
thank you so
Thank
much,
you so
Adam.
much. Thanks for the conversation and thank you all for listening.
Yeah. Bye-bye.